We are in the chapter 8 of the book of Revelation. And in the beginning of the first verse, we see that the seventh seal is open. The seventh seal that has been being opened leading up to this. And when the seventh seal is opened, it opens up another scene, if you will. The scene of the seven trumpets being blown. And when we saw that when the seventh seal was opened, the silence fell on heaven for the space of a half an hour. Before this, we've seen continual noise in heaven, right? We've seen rumblings and crashings and voices. We've seen praise being given to God. Each one of these seals, something has taken place, whether it's an earthquake or a horse bringing war or different things to the earth. Here we see that silence falls. And the picture that follows this silence, or during this silence, is an angel with the censer offering smoke or incense, and prayers to God. And at the end of this process, we see in verse 5 that he takes from the altar and he puts in the census and he hurls it to the earth. And when it hits earth, there were peals of thunder, rumblings, flashes of light, and an earthquake. We equate that, or at least in my mind, I see that something similar to a massive bomb. We noted last week that the meaning of this is that the fire of God, and we spent some time looking into the history and the symbolism of the fire of God from the altar, which was normally the blessing of the people, has in this case become the curse of the people. Now, when we started into the verse 6 then, and we looked at verses 6 through 9, we see the trumpets being blown. And with each one of these trumpets, as we go, it gets more and more involved with what takes place. But the first trump blows, and verse 7, and there is hell and fire mixed with blood, and they were thrown to the earth. And a third of the earth was burned up, and a third of the trees were burned up, and all the green grass was burned up. Now, we were a little rushed at the end of the study last week, and Mike brought up the question that where in history, this has to be in the future, because where in history have we seen a third of the earth burn up? Is that correct, Mike?
Yeah, this is prophecy, right? Future.
To John, absolutely. We both agree on that. And so I thought about that, and I don't want to be dogmatic, because I certainly don't feel as though I have all the answers, but I did think that of a couple of things to share before we continue on. And ultimately, each of you are going to have to be a judge, and there's messages through the book of Revelation that are relevant for all of us. The reason that I see this as from a standpoint of talking about Jerusalem is that view to me brings all of Scripture together. And even Jesus' last prophecy, we see it fulfilled in that. A very significant prophecy to the end. So there's some things that Mike, I think are important when we consider that. And that's at the beginning and the end of this book of Revelation. The things that John is writing is prophecy to him, but it's said no less than 3 times to him, these are about to happen. This is at hand. Secondly, we see that these verses, or this book was to be read in each of the 7 churches. And each of those 7 churches, in verse 3, we see those that hear it, those who read it, and those who keep it or understand it will be blessed. So to me, I believe that means that the people of that time, it was meaningful for them. They were going through a tremendous tribulation. And for God to write to them and say, I'm going to tell you things that you have no way of understanding, but 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years later, this is what's going to happen. I'm not sure how comforting that is going to be to them. You say, well, spiritually it would be. But I think we're talking about physical judgment on these people. Additionally, Matthew 24 and verse 14, when Jesus is answering the question about what will be the sign of the end of the age or the end of these things, he says that that all this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout all the world as a testimony to the nations, and then the end will come. That world, I think, is at the basis of what we're talking about. And I think that's relevant for us to understand what Revelation 8's talking about, because if we take that to mean the globe, then I'm absolutely on board that this is something that has to happen in the future, because a third of the globe has not been burned up. However, Jesus, in that same prophecy, made 2 other statements. He said that this, 21, for then there will be a great tribulation, such has not been from the beginning of the world until now, and shall never be. That's verse 21. In verse 34, as he's continued on, he says, truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all of these things take place. To me, that, and I believe Revelation is a parallel of Matthew 24, because Jesus is obviously speaking of Jerusalem. Then he's talking about the land, not necessarily the whole globe. That word is used, GES is the most common word that is used to translate it earth. And it's used sometimes to mean all the tillable land, all dry land, essentially. But other times, and most commonly, it's used to mean the known world. In fact, in Romans 1 and 8, Paul wrote to the Roman church, and he said, your faith is known throughout the entire world, or the whole world. Well, we aren't talking about North America or South America in that case. He's talking about the GS, the land, the Roman Empire, the known world. Sometimes it's more specific to mean the world. Along with that, Colossians 1 and 6, Paul proclaims exactly what Jesus said, and that's why I brought Matthew 24 and 14, that before these things would take place, that the gospel would be proclaimed throughout all the world. And in Colossians 1 and 6, Paul proclaims it was proclaimed throughout all the world. That world has 2 different meanings. In each case, we have to figure out whether it means the land, the known land, the land of Israel, or the whole world. I hope that doesn't come off dogmatic, but I did feel compelled to support, because of everything we're going to say forward, it has to stand on some basis.
Why do you say Matthew parallels Revelation?
Well,
Where do you get that?
Because
I just don't understand where you get that.
And you were traveling a couple weeks when I laid the foundation for that, Mike. But each of these seals goes hand in hand with what Jesus says. For instance, the first seal parallels verses 6 and 7 of what Jesus says is going to happen. There's an army. The second seal, found in chapter 6 and verse 3, parallels what he says in verse 7 with the civil war that is prophesied. The very next seal opens up the famine. And guess what Jesus talks about right after the civil war? The famine and pestilence. And so it goes down through and is a direct parallel in that way. Now, I'm not saying that's the exclusive interpretation. I'm just telling you that's where I'm coming from and how I've come to that. And by the way, I appreciate Mike speaking up and saying, it's not how I see that. And I'm sure he still doesn't, because that's thought processes, right? That's what we're doing, is we're examining these and trying our best. This, I believe, the most difficult book in the Bible to see what it means. Okay, so with that, a quick review. Verse 7 is the first trumpet. And as I mentioned before, there's hail and fire mixed with blood, and these are thrown to the earth. Don't forget that for chapter 11 and verse 8 and verse 7, really, if we read this, I think clarifies exactly what John is talking about when he's talking about who all these are coming into. And he says in 7, and when they have finished their testimony, the beast that rises from the bottomless pit will make war on them and conquer them and kill them. And their dead bodies will lie in the street of the great city that symbolically is called Sodom and Egypt, where the Lord was crucified. That's Revelation 11, 7 and 8. So we see there that Jerusalem, the Lord was crucified in Jerusalem. Symbolically, she is Egypt and Sodom. Elsewhere, we'll see her called Babylon. And so we will see parallels between the destruction of Egypt, between the destruction of Sodom, and between the destruction of Babylon as we go through. And I believe we see the 10 plagues throughout these trumpets being played out. And with the hail here, but this hail is mixed with fire and with blood. I believe what Jesus is telling Paul is it's bringing to their minds the idea of catapults. Now, when Roman, I mentioned the BBC did a series on Vespasian. I got a chance. I've been traveling in the evenings to pick Whitey up till his car was done. So in the evening, last Wednesday night, when I went home to wait until it was time to go get him, I started watching it. And it's quite interesting. It's not all about his campaign against Jerusalem, but really is a different perspective or shows a lot of what we're talking about. And what Vespasian does is he comes from the north down through Judea, Galilee and then Samaria, then Judea, is he doesn't just conquer the cities, which he does, but they are destroying the land as they come and burning. So a third of the globe has not been burned up, but at this time, it certainly is the case that a third of Judea and the relevant land is burned up. A third of the trees are burned up. Notice that all the green grass is burned up. At this time, they were a farming, agricultural, herding group of people. And so what Christ is saying through John is your ability to make a living is going to be completely destroyed. And it was. This is the end of the nation of Jerusalem at this time. Secondly, and if there's questions or comments, yell them out, throw something, and we'll stop and deal with it. But second then, the second trumpet, we see something. I'll read it, 8 and 9. In the second trumpet, the second angel blew his trumpet, and something like a great mountain, burning with fire, was thrown into the sea, and a third of the sea became blood, a third of the living creatures in the sea died, and a third of the ships were destroyed. So we started to talk last week, and we read from Jeremiah, the 51st chapter, about God calling Babylon a great mountain. If you go to your Strong's Concordance, and look up mountain, you will see many times throughout the Old Testament verbiage that nations are referred to as mountains. Babylon was referred to in Jeremiah 51, 24 and 25 that we read last week is the great destroying mountain that destroyed the whole world. And she was going to be brought down. So if we take the mountain to be symbolic of a nation, I believe that we see this idea of a destroying nation, because it's a mountain on fire, a volcano we're thinking is what it looks like. A destroying nation, and is thrown into the sea. By the way, the Egyptian army sank in the Red Sea, was said to have sunk like a great rock. Very close to the idea of a mountain sinking in the sea. But what we see here, I believe, is something interesting. If you turn to Matthew 21, 18 through 22. When I looked at this, in this light, it really was a moment that I said, wow, that's incredible. This is Jesus, 18 through 22, Matthew 21. In the morning he was returning to the city, and he became hungry. And seeing a fig tree by the wayside, he went to it and found nothing on it but only leaves. And he said to it, "May no fruit ever come from you again." And the fig tree withered, how quickly? Right away, at once. Verse 20. Then the disciples saw it, they marveled, saying, "How did the fig tree wither at once?" Now, isn't that interesting? That they've seen Jesus heal people's eyes, deal with their withered hands, make them walk again. All this instantaneously, heal them of leprosy, right? And here they say, how is it this fig tree withers all at once? Now, it's been universally recognized that Jesus is using this as a simile of Jerusalem and of the Jewish nation, right? At the time they were to bear fruit, the Messiah has come. This is the pinnacle, should have been the pinnacle of the Jewish nation. It is time for harvest, and they reject the Messiah. At the time they should be bearing fruit for Jesus Christ or for God, they completely reject him. Notice this switch in Jesus' simile as we get into verse 21. Now remember, then to 20 they asked, "How did it wither so quickly?" And Jesus answered them, "Truly I say to you, if you have faith and do not doubt, you will not only do what has been done to the fig tree, but even if you say to this mountain, 'Be taken up and thrown into the sea,' it will happen. And whatsoever you ask in prayer, you will receive it if you have faith." It's interesting to me there is Jesus takes that simile and he changes it immediately. We see no cases of the apostles moving mountains, but we do see them bringing down the Jewish nation via submitting themselves to Jesus Christ. Interesting. I'm not 100% certain that's the only application of those verses, but I do believe there's a connection there. So Jerusalem is a destroying nation at this time. They've killed the prophets, they've killed the Messiah, and they have rejected Jesus Christ. The next several points are going to draw that out even more clear. Now, how are they thrown into the sea? Well, it's interesting on a couple of levels. Number one, symbolically, it symbolizes their utter destruction, right? If you throw a mountain into the sea, it's not much of a mountain anymore, is it? It's covered up. It's not what we think of as imposing. But Josephus, in his third book, and I have two collections, I have two different copies of Josephus' writings, but in his third book, he wrote in several books. Most of them are about the Jewish wars. Some of them are about the Jewish, they're called Jewish wars or Jewish antiquities. Antiquities are more of the Old Testament history. Josephus' third book, chapter 10 in section 9, tells about a great battle. Shortly after the victory over Joppa, Vespasian is coming south and he's burning the land, destroying the land, and he comes to Galilee. Now, Josephus calls it by a different name. The Sea of Galilee is called by so many different names. And the Jews put on a big stand there. Some 6,000 Jews are killed along the Galilee, and the Romans sink all of their ships. So many bodies die and are left to rot and decay in the Sea of Galilee that Josephus says all of the fish are killed, and the stench is unbearable. Now, that sounds, whether he's talking specifically of that battle or not, that sounds, and certainly it fits into the time frame, very close to the burning great mountain that was thrown into the sea, and a third of the sea became blood. A third of the living creatures in the sea died, and a third of the ships were destroyed. By the way, I forgot to talk about this idea of 1/3. I believe the 1/3 is being used to be a significant portion, but to contrast versus a total destruction. Does that make sense? Because if you look at the end of this chapter, verse 13, we see, "Then I looked and I heard an eagle crying with a loud voice, and it flew directly overhead. Woe, woe, woe to those who dwell on the earth, at the blast of the other trumpets that these three angels are about to blow." When we get to the end of the first four trumpets, the eagle flies over and he says, "Disaster, disaster, disaster." And then remember, we read from chapter 11, verse 8, towards the end of this, that we're going to have the dead bodies laying in Jerusalem. So I think the third is to be significant amount of destruction, but to contrast from a total destruction that is going to inevitably come with these last trumpets.
Mine says angel.
Yeah, angel.
Okay. And there is some difference between the some of the manuscripts. It's not so much translation in this case, but some manuscripts seem to imply an angel, some an eagle. So that's the difference. The message is very clear throughout this. So that's led some to believe it was a cherubim that we oftentimes read of, look at an angel with an eagle appearance come through. So, Amanda.
Do you know offhand how long the campaign against the Jews lasted? I didn't realize it started so far north.
Yes, and I'm going to put you off on that. I believe it starts right around 67, because the beginning of chapter 9, I think, is we're going to deal with that. So, total, there's some gap in between, but around 3 years. But I'll explain that a little bit further when we get further. Okay, so verse 10 and 11 is the third trumpet. And the third angel blew his trumpet, and a great star fell from heaven, blazing like a torch, and it fell on the third of the rivers and on the springs of the water. The name of the star is Wormwood. A third, does King James not say bitter there? Yeah, I'll explain that in just a moment. A third of the waters became wormwood or bitter, and many people died from the water because it had been made bitter. So let's first I'll deal with wormwood since I mentioned that, and there's that difference in translation. Throughout the Old Testament, wormwood was a plant, a tree that was very, very bitter to the point of being poisonous. And we see it throughout, for instance, Proverbs 5 through 4. Proverbs 5 and 4 uses that idea. And it became universal with suffering, the idea of wormwood or bitter water. Remember, after the Israelites come out of Egypt, they come across bitter water, and they begin to murmur. They were good at that. And so eventually Moses takes a log and throws into the water, and it's healed. And that's a contrast between what we're seeing here. Because at the end of that, as you read, he says, be faithful to me. This is a Mikeism, Mike paraphrase. Be faithful to me, and I will never become your wormwood. At the end of that plague. And so there's a contrast. But a wormwood is a plant, a tree that makes very bitter and even is poisonous. And they were used as synonyms so oftentimes at that time.
It says a star fell from heaven. A great star, doesn't say plant.
Okay, I'm in 11 because I jumped ahead.
It's from continuing from 10, because 10 talks about this star, so it goes on to say, and the name of the star is called wormwood. The name of the star is called wormwood.
Mm-hmm.
Okay?
So the King James said bitter there, right? No.
Made the water bitter.
So wormwood is used there. Okay.
It's the name of the star.
I've
It's
caused
called
that
wormwood.
confusion. Because there are places that wormwood is translated bitter in some of the translations.
So it doesn't say that wormwood is bitter. It just says the name of the star was wormwood.
Right.
And it made the water bitter.
Right.
Or
So
poisonous, I take it.
yes, in wormwood, I was explaining what wormwood is.
Right.
And it's a very bitter tree, and there's that contrast between the plague. So,
But it's the star that causes it.
yes, absolutely. The star causes it, and it causes the waters to become bitter to the point of poisonous.
A star
Right.
being a meteorite?
So I think that's the picture, right? A meteorite's what we would call it, an asteroid.
You tell me.
I think that's the literal picture that we're getting. Stars were used to mean priest or I didn't mean to say priest, rulers and officials.
Out of heaven, Mike. This star came out of heaven.
Mm-hmm.
Star from heaven, burning, as it were, a lamp. That sounds like a meteorite to me.
Yes, that is the actual picture we're getting. So I think to understand what John is meaning, the way I've explained it in past is we're seeing pictures as though we're watching a movie, but all of these symbols mean something. So the meteor is what we're actually seeing, a star falling from heaven.
That's what I see.
Yep, absolutely. So what is the symbolic meaning of it? Throughout all of Scripture, and by the way, I keep saying those things because I've literally spent hours and hours going, and I've quit turning my pages, and I've brought up 3, 4, 5 different Bibles on my computer, and I go and cross-reference, where the Bible talks about stars, where it talks about mountains and things like that. And if I give you all these passages, we'll never get anywhere. But feel free to, I'll share those with you as we go forward. But throughout Scripture, a very good example of this is Joseph, right? When he's having his dreams, one of the dreams are his brothers are stars. and his father and mother, sun and moon, right? They're rulers. And we oftentimes see that. This star is not just a ruler, it is from heaven. I believe it likely is the high priest. Whether you take Caiaphas or Ananias, right? Ananias. Caiaphas or Ananias. They were each the high priest, right? Depending on whether you talk to the Romans or talk to the Jews. They both sold Jesus out, didn't they? For their own benefit. They are from heaven. They are put there by God. And they don't serve God. They turn on God. Turn, if you would, to Matthew 26 and, is that 63? 26:63. I scribbled a little bit when I wrote this verse down. Matthew 26:63. This is going to be Jesus, but for the high priest. And of course, we know the high priest has been quizzing Jesus, and Jesus doesn't answer him, right? He's keeping quiet. And the high priest gets upset with that. Let's go to 62. And the high priest stood up and said, "Have you no answer to make? What is it that these men testify against you?" But Jesus, 63, remained silent. And the high priest said to him, "I adjure you by the living God, tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus responds. And he says to him, "You have said so, but I tell you from now on that you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of the power of coming on the clouds of heaven." Now, that seems absurd to us, doesn't it? Jesus' answer. I believe, from everything we've talked about with the study of Revelation, that this was clear to the high priest that what Jesus said is, you are going to be judged. Right? You are going to see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power, coming on the clouds of heaven. Those clouds were ideas of judgment that we've looked at throughout the Old Testament. Look in verse 34. Then the high priest tore his robes and said, "He has uttered blasphemy. What further witness do we need? Have you heard his blasphemy?" Notice how violently the high priest reacts to what Jesus says. I believe it's clear that he sees it as a direct threat of what Jesus said. If you would turn over to Luke, the 22nd chapter, and this is Luke's account, and Jesus makes an interesting statement about the high priest. Luke 22 and 53. Starting 52 for background sake. Then Jesus said to the high priests and officers of the temple and elders who had come out against him, "Have you come out?" Oh, I'm sorry. So this is it in the garden where they come out to arrest him. "Have you come out against a robber with swords and clubs? When I was with you day and night in the temple, you did not lay hands on me." This is the point that I wanted to get at, last statement. "But this is your hour and the power of darkness." Now, Jesus makes some other statements along these lines, but what I believe we see Jesus saying in both cases to the high priest and to the chief priest, this is your hour of darkness, or you have completely given yourself over to Satan. This was a position ordained by God. Many of them, if we were to go and look at other passages, we would see, recognize Jesus as the Messiah. And they're killing him because they do recognize him as the Messiah. For your sake, for your reference, I mean to say, Matthew 21, chapter 21, and I believe 23 and following, we have the parable of the vine dressers. Notice in that parable, we know they're crooked vine dressers, right? And when they send servants back to collect, they beat them and then they kill them. And then he sends the son and he says, surely they will recognize my son. And it's interesting, read it carefully for yourself, please. The crooked vine dressers look and they say, surely this is the heir. If we kill him, we will have the vineyard. And they kill him. And Jesus says, and what do you think the owner is going to do? Now, at the end of this, the Pharisees understand he's talking about them. In 23, chapter 23, verse 1, we see that Jesus says that the high priest is sitting on Moses' seat. I don't believe we'll ever find anywhere where that's authorized. I think what we find, what is being said, is they are usurping authority. Chapter 24 and 9, we see that they will kill Christians in the name of God. And I believe what we see here is the complete falling of a position ordained by God. And what comes out of it? The whole nation's killed for it. Waters and streams, especially in this area of the world, were of the utmost value, right? It's the only way you can live. And the star that has rightful place in heaven has fallen, and because it has fallen, it has destroyed the life source of the land. And certainly, what we do know for certain is that because of the sins of the high priest and the willingness of everyone to follow them, what should have been life became death. Questions or comments? Thank you for your time. Lord willing, we will pick up verse 12 next week. And these trumpets are kind of in depth, and but actually the next couple won't take long. I think we'll finish up chapter 8 and get through 9 as well next week if all goes well. Thank you.